Let's go to Perth and speak to Caroline Fleay, who's a professor at Curtin University's Centre for Human Rights Education. Caroline, welcome to the programme. Thank you so much for being with us. Can you give us just an understanding about these offshore detention facilities? How long has Australia been operating this policy? Did something particular happen in a specific year that led to this idea?
Well, Australia's had offshore sites of detention, which are essentially detention centres that are in other countries. First since 2001, and and they existed for about 5 or 6 years before there was a change of government, and fortunately at that time they were disbanded. But they were reopened again in 2012. Now, what we have to know about Australia, though, is that for more than 30 years under Australian law, if you come to Australia without a valid visa, you can be locked up on an indefinite basis in a site of detention in Australia. So for 30 years in Australia, you have been able to be locked up. Now, this is legislation and policy that particularly targets people who come by boat. So if you come by boat seeking asylum, these are the sorts of punitive policies that await people. Now, it was really ratcheted up in 2001, and it was at that time that the coalition government, a Conservative government, were leading into the election cycle and were not doing too well in that election cycle. And there was the arrival of a boat of more than 300 people and the boat was in distress. It was on the way to Australian waters. And it was rescued by a Norwegian freighter which wanted to bring those people to Australia because they were quite unwell. And the government just took a very hard line at that time, which was roundly popular, and forced people to go to Nauru, the country of Nauru, where a detention centre was set up so that people could be left there and not come to Australia. So government legislation was changed to enable people to be essentially warehoused in other countries. And since that time, Manus Island on Papua New Guinea has hosted another detention centre. But in Australia, we have a series of detention centres across the country, and one is on Christmas Island, which is Australian territory. And that has existed since, for several decades. And so this is where the Murugapan family have been held for 2 years at an enormous cost just to keep that one family in detention there. And, of course, now we see that detentions are incredibly unsafe places. They're bad for physical and mental health. And we have now Tharnicaa in hospital.
Yeah, OK. So we have people coming by boat who are never even allowed to see the Australian mainland because they get taken to these detention facilities. But the Murugapan family is slightly different, as you say, because they were supposed to, I presume, be placed on the mainland because that's where they were already. They didn't arrive in that same way that people might be arriving by boat. But what I wanted to ask you was how unusual it is that they should be sent to Christmas Island, because I understand there are literally tens of thousands of other people in the same situation as the Murugapan family, and their visas may expire, and they may be facing the same situation, I presume.
Well, this is right. This is a situation. So we have over 30,000 people who have made it to Australia over the past decade, and by the time that the government changed in 2013 back to the Conservative government, back to the coalition government, legislation changed. And it said that if you are going to be recognised, even if you are going to be recognised as a refugee, what that will mean is that you will never be able to settle in Australia. You will never get a permanent visa. You'll only get a temporary protection visa. Now, the Murugapan family, the parents, their refugee claim was considered, and like many others, they had to wait, 4 or 5 years. Some are still waiting for their refugee claims to be processed after all this time, and unfortunately, they were not found to be refugees. Now, in 2013, there was also legislation changed which made it harder for people to be recognised as a refugee. And most people were also denied access to funded legal assistance to prepare their claims. So literally the policy and legislation has been stacked against people. The Murugapan family, as I said, the parents were not found to be refugees. Their children were born here, and there's a court case still pending to consider whether the youngest child, Tharnicaa, could be considered to be a refugee or not. So they have been in limbo. They've essentially been on a bridging visa, but when the parents were found not to be a refugee, then that's when the government, for some reason, said, OK, we will now detain you. We want to return you to Sri Lanka. And you're quite right. There are other people who are in this situation as well. There are people who haven't been found to be a refugee, or they are waiting for court cases. So it puts people in incredibly stressful situations and in limbo because they don't know what's going to happen to them. Now, we're talking about a group of 30-odd thousand people because they could not be sent to Nauru and Manus. A lot of people who were sent to Nauru and Manus have since been brought to Australia because they were so medically unwell that they needed treatment here. But many of them continue to be in detention situations as well.
Caroline, I understand that there's a growing movement and there are petitions that have been signed to make sure that the family doesn't suffer any more than it has already. And Tharnicaa, the child you're talking about, is the one that's being treated in hospital. But I wanted to ask you just finally for a bigger and overall analysis of what is the Australian government scared of? I mean, presumably it has enough money and it has enough space to give a new home to people who are seeking refuge. Is it therefore then a question of being worried about the culture being diluted? I don't get it.
Well, there are a range of reasons around this. There's historical reasons around Australia generally so easily gets concerned when people arrive by boat. There is elements of racism, of course, as well. But what this government is scared of is the next federal election. And what they are trying to do is appeal to the rest of us, to appeal to voters in Australia, to send that message that we are the ones that can be strong on borders. We are the ones that will secure our borders. We are the ones that will stop the boats. That is the message that they're trying to send. What they, I think, are starting to realise is that they are out of step with a lot of people in Australia who are starting to realise how people are treated here. And when you have images of these beautiful girls being shown to be kept in these very punitive situations that are incredibly harmful to physical and mental health, people are starting to realise what is being done. There are so very few people that have ever made it to Australia to seek asylum, that so few people that most people in this country will never come across anyone. But we have so many people, over 30,000 people here who need homes. They need to be resettled. They need to be able to get their immediate families with them. So it's much more than the Murugapan family, but they are creating such an emblem to show how extreme this government will go to say that we are tough on borders. And as I said, there is a growing movement, all right, and there are hundreds of people in Perth who have been surrounding that hospital saying that this is not on. And there are also people within the political class who are starting to realise that we have the main opposition party who are finally starting to, stand up and say we cannot treat people in this way, and that is very welcome. So it will be very interesting, I think, to see what happens over the next few days with the government, because I don't think this pressure is going to back down.
Caroline, thank you so much indeed for speaking to us on TRT World's The News Hour. Caroline Fleay from Curtin University in Perth.